I now look to Jason Xiao, member of the Debate Selection Committee, Wadham College, to open the case for the opposition.
While the first proposition speaker was stargazing, in that approximately 8-minute speech, 120 children died of starvation. The position on opposition in this debate is very simple, that while space research is a noble and good goal, it does not warrant being put above all the other priorities, and that some of the $21.5 billion that's been put in NASA this year alone ought to go towards other deserving causes. I'm going to demonstrate to you that our future is not in space with 3 arguments. First, I'm going to prove to you that the benefits that come from space research are incredibly speculative, and that if they could be achieved, we could get better goals accomplished with that amount of resources we put in. Second of all, I'm going to prove to you that the benefits of space research will never be distributed equitably. And lastly, I'm going to talk about the pressing concerns that we currently face, which we ought to address. Before doing so, it does fall upon me to introduce the proposition bench in this debate. Who you just heard from was Mushab Butt, a second-year PPE student at Christ Church, Oxford. After trying to discover more about Mushab, I've determined that he's probably an MI6 agent. No one was able to provide anything salient, even after dozens of messages and plenty of people asked. And the only thing that I managed to hear was that Mushab is a high-ranking official in the very sinister-sounding organization, the Guild. While I discovered that it is really just a student society for speakers much like this one, I still think that he probably has something secret going on there. Speaking second for the proposition is Mahi Joshi. On paper, it appears as if she's a third-year PPE student at Trinity College. But, as Chin informs me, Mahi is really a third-year Union Studies student at Fruin Court, Oxford. For such a starry-eyed idealist, I am somewhat surprised that she is willing to betray her values and betray all the ideas that she has about hope on Earth. But for anyone familiar with hacks during election week, it is relatively normal for someone to betray their values or friends, especially for the Leon extraordinaire. Speaking third for the proposition is Leroy Chiao. Dr. Chiao is a former NASA astronaut and was the commander of the International Space Station. He is now a co-founder and CEO of One Orbit, which provides keynotes and training to companies and schools. Speaking fourth for the proposition is Ellen Stofan. Dr. Stofan is the former chief scientist of NASA, helping guide the development of a long-range plan to get humans to Mars. She is currently the director of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum and is the first woman to hold this position. Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, these are our guests, and they are very welcome. Now, on to my arguments. First, I'm going to demonstrate that there is very little chance that we will get anything of substantial value from space research. And I want to limit this discussion, because the proposition could talk about far-fetched ideas like new medicines that we haven't even discovered. But if they want to talk about implausible things like that, it is equally plausible and equally likely that something like the real-life version of the horror movie Alien could occur. So we should limit this discussion to what scientific developments we've already accrued and what we know. And the biggest thing that could potentially come from space research is the ability to make Mars habitable. And indeed, I think that is a goal of the proposition, given that we want a sustainable planet that we can all live upon. But let's look at the data. If we look at it, it's incredibly difficult to make Mars habitable because of the fact that there is no water on the surface. That means that you can't do basic things like grow crops or actually ensure that you can tend for livestock. Now, there are various suggestions and solutions for how to deal with this problem. Perhaps it's the case that you could use greenhouse gases to just warm the biosphere and make it habitable. But unfortunately, studies already suggest that there isn't sufficient CO2 or greenhouse gases on Mars to be able to do that. Maybe the solution is to terraform the planet bit by bit, make sure that there are small developments. But that's an untested and incredibly unlikely solution to come about. Now, let's say it does occur, that we find some kind of solution to making Mars habitable. I would suggest we could have put all that money into funding things like climate change research, or making sure that we funnel people towards the climate change science field, rather than spending all of our money on this particular issue. And in fact, Mushab wanted that. But his solution was, in terms of dealing with climate change, to fund space research as a way of dealing with climate change. Whereas I think the more logical thing is to put all of our time, money, and funding into dealing with climate change directly. Because at the end of the day, NASA spends a lot of money on things that aren't creating solar panels in dust-filled areas. And even with that dust, it might not be human dust or Earth dust, which is similar. So we should limit our aspirations towards the things that are actually identifiable on the ground here today, because those are the things that we can actually solve and are some of the most pressing issues that currently exist. Second, I'm now going to demonstrate that even if we found a way to make space research viable, it wouldn't be equitably distributed. And I want you to consider this question. If we made Mars habitable, what's next? Do we get all 7 billion people on this planet right now to go up to Mars? Given that it's been 3 years of Brexit negotiations and Britain hasn't even left the UK, I'm not really sure what this mass population transfer to Mars would really look like. And in that circumstance, that means that all of the gains that we get from space research, if it's designed to solve the biggest problem of our time, climate change, will never go to the most vulnerable or those who need it the most. There will be people left behind because of the natural constraints that exist. The constraints that come from science, the fact that we don't know how to shuttle 7 billion people up to Mars. But also the constraints that come from resources. The fact that governments are remarkably unlikely to fund every single person on this planet to get to Mars. And those resource constraints mean that there's a very real possibility that those benefits only go to the most wealthy or those who are most privileged. But there's a trade-off in this debate. We could be funding things like climate change or poverty relief, and in the absence of that, we're funding space research. So what ends up happening is that we might not be able to get 7 billion, and maybe it's fine, but we have lost lives along the way, and we haven't dealt with climate change or other crises that currently exist. So it is true that we don't expect the proposition to say we need to get all 7 billion people up into space, but they still need to defend why it is that this system is better than just solving climate change directly and helping all 7 billion people who live on this planet right now, rather than the select few thousand who get to go to Mars. Now, I'm going to end off this speech by discussing why, even if you got some of the innovations that the proposition wants, some kind of discovery of Mars being habitable, or some discovery of climate change technology, why it is that we ought to prefer all the problems that currently exist on Earth right now. The first reason why is because the present suffering that exists is inexcusable. The fact that there are starving children out there who we could be helping. And note, many of these problems are responsibilities that we all share. The fact, for instance, that the Western world has emitted a massive amount of carbon emissions and led to things like floods within developing countries, and that those same privileged people are the ones who are most likely to be able to go to Mars one day if we do end up making it habitable. The second thing that I want to identify is that our concerns on Earth are always going to follow us. That even if we manage to escape this planet, this particular little blue dot, that doesn't mean the problems that underlaid the structural problems of our civilization have gone away. The problem of, for instance, overconsumption leading to things like climate change. If that is the case, why would it not happen again on Mars? If that was the case, then why won't the same problems follow us and make that that planet uninhabitable one day? We need to solve these root issues because they're not only just the most important, but root issues that will follow us no matter where we go. So, at the end of the day, the proposition presented a case that was incredibly non-exclusive. If we wanted to get the benefits of climate change research, just fund climate change. If you want to get the benefits of international cooperation, subsidize international cooperation on scientific projects. The burden on the proposition was high. They need to prove to you that our future was in space. And what we've said on the opposition is that while taking responsibility for the problems that we've created here is hard, it is a necessary task, and is the only fair and just way of ensuring that everyone gets their fair share and is protected. As such, I urge you to vote nay. Thank you.